Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Man at YouTube with another airbrush compressor combination review. Today we are looking at a Chinese Amazon eBay no-name import. So we've got the instructions, very standard information. The JJ-110 12 volt air compressor. It's very similar to all the others, has a finer dial, and unlike the 20 something PSI the other ones like the King Max can reach, this one does it at a whopping 30 PSIs. It's a little stronger, it can do single action, double action, it just has that little more oomph. So we'll unbox it and have a look at what we're playing with. Initially when I looked at it, I was not a huge fan as it deals with the rubber hose opposed to the braided hose. It's not really a big deal. I'm just more of a fan of the braided hose. And the airbrush is a very classic double action gravity feed high sink. Now interestingly, this is the same airbrush that they used to make about 10 years ago. So it's got an insanely loose tolerance. And the cone back. So it's going to require lubricant, and yeah, it's got the classic internals with very loose flash and whatnot. We're going to pull it apart and lubricate it as we do all other airbrushes. So that is not a big deal at all. We get the standard water trap, the hose with the connector at the end. The connector is normally attached to the airbrush right here, but they've just chucked it straight on the hose for some reason, just so you know you can put the filter on it. The power supply, 100 to 240 volts, so United States, European, Australia, Asian use, wherever it goes. You do have the standard American plug, though I've bought a box of these so I can plug that in and use it for my country's purpose. A little bit of an adapter. Whoops, that just went flying. The plastic's very tight, and that just seems to just jam in there. I'll have a little time to fiddle around. And the airbrush just sits in there, no problems, you can fill up with paint. It's got about 1 meter of hose, everything's plug and play. Just force it, it's a very tight fit. And this end screws into our water trap. The water trap collects any oil, water, debris, everything. It's far superior to a water trap. I've done a review on this, and it's pretty much the same model as you see everywhere else. You push the little brass bit down when it's full of air to dispel any sort of moisture. The fit is very tight. Do not tighten too fit, just enough to bite into the plastic. You'll split it and it will lose a significant amount of pressure. Airbrush on the top. We'll plug it in and have a go at it. Had a bit of a play around, completely hooked it up. First thing, even though the hose was connected there, it wasn't done properly and was leaking air quite substantially. So once I forced it all the way in and tightened it up, that worked well as well here. There is no leaking air whatsoever. The dial, I'm not very impressed with. There's not that much minuscule control. The pump works like any other airbrush. It builds up pressure to PSI. Once you open it, it blasts all the air out and sits somewhere between the 11 to 18 PSI mark. So realistically, it doesn't have a lot of control. What this is really good for is when you start spraying and it's built up pressure, it just shoots out a ton of air, blasting everything. If you dial it down all the way to the bottom or near quite low and you start spraying, it comes out more gentle, and as you're spraying you increase it, you finish your parts, you turn it back down and pull your finger off the trigger. Doing a bit of a test. This is how loud it is. Generally about the same as any other compressor. I'd assume that all motors inside them is quite similar. So I'm going to push it all the way to the top. It does vibrate around. And you can hear that it's just an initial very large amount of air being pushed out. Let it build up again. Put it all the way to the bottom. And it's a lot more gentle. And you just build it up a bit more. And you could do your spraying and whatnot. Though generally if you spray off the model, you dispel most of the air, so it's not that much of a big deal. We'll pull the airbrush apart, then test some paint out. So this is the first time in a very long time that I have dealt with a very old pattern hyacinth. The tolerances are crazy tight in some points and incredibly loose in others. It does take the same parts as Iwata, Hyacinth, newer ones, King Max, all those other brands, though, as well as Sparmax. So used in a dry fashion, it does have a tendency of being trickier, quicker to clog, leak or whatnot. Lubricating it up as we're going to be doing it now is going to give you a lot easier go. So the first thing you always do when you get a new airbrush, if it's one you've used before or brand spanking new, pull it apart and put it together a few times and you lubricate the inside. We're using Vaseline petroleum jelly and Q-tips, and you just lightly grease up the internals. I do this in virtually all of my airbrush videos, so I do not really have to demonstrate the whole process. I, however, can show some of the components like greasing up the trigger slightly with a bit of glaze, filling it up with a reasonable amount inside the whole body up to the point where there is a wall separating the paint chamber. Having a look at this assembly, later Hyacinths, the little tongue is removed. Don't lose the spring, though we definitely grease up this component for far easier movements, especially if paint leaks behind the trigger. You won't have dry paint sticking metal on metal. You're going to have a case of paint and lubricant mixing together, which will give you an easy time to pull apart, clean out with a great amount of ease, soak, flush, whatever, and then put back together. So this goes together, needle through, pinched here with the needle nut, and your needle can go backwards and forwards. This is the tricky bit. We put the trigger in first and make sure you have a bit of spring going in and out. So beginners and other people takes a few goes. The tongue goes in that way, sticking up, and screw until tight. Like so. The rest of it is very, very straightforward. You be very careful with the nozzle. Do not damage, do not split, as that will ruin the atomization, as well as bending the needle. The needle can be rehoned. The nozzle can be replaced. There are appropriate videos. This airbrush does come to my attention, does not come with a nozzle wrench, which is a huge disadvantage. That will have to be purchased with another airbrush. Though Ophia sells 2 wrenches on Amazon and eBay for just a few dollars, you will have to purchase that. Make sure the needle is nice and flush to the nozzle, and we pull it back and put the crown on nice and tight. For the back on, we have a greased up, ready to operate airbrush, spray some thinner. Let's paint a few lines. So it's all spread out. At the lower PSI, it whistles. It atomizes fairly okay-ish. And you're able to do very, very, very fine lines. Though it's just not quite enough air. I'm going to crank it up to about halfway. And it doesn't whistle as much. The spray pattern with the lubricant is not too bad. The pressure is sufficient enough. Doesn't seem to be heating up as much as other units. It's staying quite cool. Let's do a very large spray. Lots of orange peel, lots of overspray. The needle and nozzle should be replaced fairly immediately, as this is an older make of hyacinth. It's probably some leftover stock or something that couldn't be sold out too well. Let's try all the way at the higher setting. And that is very smooth. And just adjusting and turning it off, I could see that now, fully closed at the highest PSI. Paint is leaking through the needle and nozzle, so I'm just resetting the needle in and checking if it's still leaking. If so, that's disgraceful. Yeah, it can't go to seal. That's with the trigger closed. So going to lower the PSI to halfway, and yeah, the airbrush is not very good. It's not ideal. You're going to need parts to fix this up. Does not want to reset itself. Though with about $5 to $10 of parts, you can get this airbrush up to snuff, no problems. The compressor is definitely very, very sufficient. Shades alright, colours in alright, but you can tell by the overspray it's not that good. And I do remember learning off this airbrush when I was very, very young, about several to 10 years ago. Haven't had the chance to get my hands on one. Did not remember if they were truly, you know, really good, or it was my experiences, or they were really bad. The cases are, it's terrible. The airbrush from this set is just not sufficient at all. The compressor's perfectly fine. Now, the setup was a little more expensive than the King Max and the other ones I bought, only really by $10. It's not a big deal. Depending on the region and location, it may be cheaper or whatnot. It's definitely worthwhile using. The complaints I have are so easy to overcome if this is the only model you have access to, or you just happen to have it in your possession. Improving the airbrush is not a big deal. You just need to throw the needle and the nozzle out, replace it with a new one. The tolerance will be much tighter, and you'll be able to get a far more smoother, easier spray. I am quite disappointed that it does not come with the nozzle wrench, so you can't replace that even if you order the needle and nozzles. That definitely needs to be bought. I'm happy with the compressor. The dial is fairly useless. The middle setting is the best. The upper setting, single action if you really want to, metallics. As far as I go, yes. Though the hose, I'm not a big fan of the hose. The hose works perfectly fine, and if it breaks you can just buy another one very, very cheap and fit it, or even a much longer one. The longer the hose, the more storage you get, so you can get a significant up in meters, coil it up somewhere, and have a bit of a play with that. Though all in all, yeah, it's good enough, though it is down with the more rubbishy ones that I have reviewed. So if you have access to all of Amazon or eBay and you can get the King Max one, stick to that. This one is not quite up to snuff, and the increased PSI promised from the manual, not really the case. I would not trust that with really good single action atomization or something like Vallejo or high gloss finishes coming out of this quickly. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content. There are still quite a few different makes and models of these on the market. I'll slowly buy them up, try them out, and pass them on. See you later.